large. Under appropriate conditions, that power may be activated or actualized with the result that the substance is modified by some quality or accident. It becomes white or it is large. Crucially, any change of this sort requires a cause which elicits the actualization of the form, where before it was not F, now it is F. And this cause in general will be the activity of a substance distinct from the substance that undergoes the change in its qualities or accidents. There are two respects in which Leibniz distinguishes his account of change from Aristotle's. The first is that he denies that there is any real causal interaction among substances. Consequently, if change requires the activation of a substantial power, it cannot occur through the action of something external on that substance. Any change in a substance's states has to be elicited from within. Accordingly, Leibniz emphasizes that any substance is spontaneous in all its actions. The second point on which Leibniz distinguishes his account from Aristotle's is his denial that the notion of substantial power involves any notion of potential or an unrealized capacity for change. And this is passage 8 from the 1694 paper on the emendation of the concept of substance. The concept of forces or powers, which the Germans call Kraft and the French la force, and for whose explanation I have set up the distinct science of dynamics, brings the strongest light to bear upon our understanding of the true concept of substance. Active force differs from the mere power familiar to the schools, for the active power or faculty of the scholastics is nothing but a near possibility of acting, which needs an external excitation or a stimulus, as it were, to be transferred into action. Active force, in contrast, contains a certain act or entelechy, and is thus midway between the faculty of acting and the act itself, and involves a conatus. It is thus carried into action by itself, and needs no help but only the removal of an impediment. Leibniz's elaboration of the claim that to act a substance needs no help but only the removal of an impediment relies on physical examples usually, such as the release of a compressed spring. Because he relies on these kinds of examples, it's not a lot of help in understanding exactly what's going on in the substance itself, right? Because you don't have external impediments at all, it seems. One point he's intent on making is that because there can be no external excitation of a substance must be brought to action from within. Given this, he believes that it is inappropriate to think of a substance as containing merely the possibility or potentiality of acting. Rather, a substance is already fully actual, or what Aristotle calls an entelechy. In the Monadology, Leibniz writes, one can call all simple substances or created monads entelechies, for they have in themselves a certain perfection. They have a sufficiency that makes them the sources of their internal actions and, so to speak, incorporeal automata. Looking at all the Kantians there. At one level, the picture Leibniz paints of substance is clear enough. Every substance is by nature a source of activity. Its activity is expressed in changing states, in the case of monads, perceptual states. A question that dogs Leibniz's account, however, is how to conceptualize a substance's transition from one state to another. Leibniz believes that the change is explained by the power intrinsic to the substance, that the modification of that power expressed in any state of the substance is a sufficient reason for its determination in a subsequent state. The problem with this account is that, thus stated, it seems no less ad hoc than the appeal to occult powers that Leibniz criticizes. Leibniz rejects the idea that to explain phenomena of repulsion or attraction, it suffices to posit a magnetic power. How are we any better off in positing a substantial power which expresses itself in a succession of distinct states of the substance? And it seems equally ad hoc. There is a power that does it. The concern here is that there is nothing in the concept of an active power as such, even one that is more entelechia than dunamis, that would allow us to understand why that power should give rise to one set of effects mediated by a series of changing determinations rather than another. Arguably, we have here exactly the same sort of violation of the principle of intelligibility that Leibniz elsewhere inveighs against. It would be going too far to say that Leibniz himself sees the problem in exactly the way I've set it up, but he frames his account of substance in a way that allows an answer to it. The answer comes in the essay De Ipsa Natura in the course of responding to occasionalist accounts of divine action. Against such accounts, Leibniz stresses that in giving an order or law to the universe, God must be understood as doing more than just issuing a command, which is a mere extrinsic denomination of creatures. That is, things don't happen just by God saying, happen. More has to be involved. Instead, there must follow, Leibniz says, an enduring impression in the thing itself in the form of, quote, an inherent law from which both actions and passions follow. Leibniz's reasoning invokes the same considerations of intelligibility as we saw at work in his critique of other philosophers. If all change is to be accounted for through the activity of substance, and substances act spontaneously, then there must be something about the nature of substance that accounts for its particular series of states. As Leibniz sees this can only be a law that is inherent in the nature of the substance itself. This is passage 9. It is not sufficient to say that God, creating things from the beginning, willed that they follow a certain definite law in their change, progressus. If we imagine that this will have been so ineffective that things are not affected by it and no lasting effect was produced in them. But if indeed the law God laid down left some trace of itself impressed on things, if by his command things were formed in such a way that they were rendered appropriate for fulfilling the will of the command, then already we must admit that a certain efficacy has been placed in things, a form or force, something like what we usually call by the name nature, something from which the series of phenomena follow in accordance with the prescript of the first command. Again, we find Leibniz insisting against occasionalist accounts of divine action that the effects of a substance's changing states must be accounted for in terms of some fact about its own nature. Anything less than this would render such change a perpetual miracle. However, the assumed spontaneity of substance places unique demands upon that nature. If a substance is the spontaneous cause of all its own states, there must be something about its nature which determines that just those states and no others follow from it. According to Leibniz, this implies that a substance's nature must incorporate a law, whereby the series of phenomena follow in accordance with the prescript of the first command. Thus, just as the demand for intelligibility leads Leibniz from laws to powers, in the case of substance, it leads him from powers to laws. Okay, last section, we're getting there. The laws of substantial change. There might still seem to be an important asymmetry between the grounding of physical laws in bodily powers and the explanation of a substance's primitive active power in terms of an individual law of the series. In the first case, Leibniz is concerned with the general laws of nature that hold of certain kinds of things, in particular bodies. In the second case, he is concerned less with the law of nature, it might seem, than with what might be described as a program, a complete and fully articulated specification of a substance's states. Everything will follow from that law exactly as it happens. This clearly is the notion of law that Leibniz associates most closely with the nature of an individual substance. In the Thesis, he asserts that, quote, by nature, every simple substance has perceptions, and that its individuality consists in the perpetual law which brings about the series of perceptions that are assigned to it and that arise naturally one from another. Yet this is not the only notion of law that Leibniz invokes in accounting for the changes that occur in the perceptual states of a monad. One of his most common ways of characterizing the doctrine of pre-established harmony is to contrast the laws that govern changes in souls with the laws that govern changes in bodies. He writes in the Monadology, section 79, souls act according to the laws of final causes through repetitions, ends, and means. Bodies act according to the laws of efficient causes or motions. And these two kingdoms, that of efficient causes and final causes, are in harmony with each other. The laws of final causes dictate the order of perceptual change in a monad. Leibniz writes in the Principles of Nature and Grace, the perceptions in the monad arise from one another by the laws of appetite, or by the laws of the final causes of good and evil, which consist in notable perceptions, ordered and disordered. Increasingly in his late writings, Leibniz takes on the project of explaining change in the monad by appeal to a distinct class of laws, laws of appetites, laws of final causes, that govern the operation of a distinct type of force, appetition. As he writes in the Monadology, the monad's natural changes come from an internal principle, since no external cause can influence it internally. The action of the internal principle, which brings about the change or passage from one perception to another, can be called appetition. This characterization of Leibniz's project raises two significant questions. First, adverting to his broader program of accounting for the reality of physical forces, as modifications of a substance's primitive active power, it is reasonable to ask whether there's not a kind of explanatory gap here. As they figure in physical explanations, derivative forces are not obviously appetitive forces. Admittedly, Leibniz employs the psychologistic terminology of his day, conatus, striving, solicitation, to characterize the basic elements of force, what he calls dead force. But it is worth asking whether the entelechy or primitive active force to which he appeals in accounting for physical forces is plausibly construed as an appetitive force that strives for a perceived good. There just doesn't seem to be an obvious implication of that. Second, it is not clear that this is the kind of force that Leibniz himself requires to account for change in the monad itself. And now I'm getting to the main point. Recall Leibniz's definition of change as a complex of two opposing states, together with a force or reason for that change. Whatever the force that accounts for change in a monad, it must be a force that provides a sufficient reason, together with any laws that govern it, for the transition from one perceptual state to another. In other words, the existence of that force, in conjunction with the laws governing its operation, must determine the state that follows from the prior state. That, I think, is a given for Leibniz. Whether appetitive forces, together with the laws of appetite, can be understood to satisfy this condition depends, I think, on how we interpret those forces. If we interpret them as forces determined in their direction and magnitude by a certain possibly confused representation of the good, I am skeptical that they can be. The difficulty can be put succinctly via a passage I have already partly cited from Monadology, section 15. That's passage 10 on the handout. The action of the internal principle, which brings about the change or passage from one perception to another, can be called appetition. It is true that the appetite cannot always completely reach the new perception towards which it tends, but it always obtains something of it and reaches new perceptions. As Leibniz acknowledges here, appetites directed toward a representation of the good often fail to be satisfied. As a result of its endeavor, a monad reaches some new state, but it is not a state reliably, i.e. deterministically, associated with the occurrence of the appetite. As things go, the occurrence of the same appetite, together with the laws of appetite, can be associated with different incompatible outcomes. Hence, such an account fails to satisfy the requirement implicit in Leibniz's definition of change that there be a sufficient reason for the change in a monad's perceptual state. Now, it may immediately be met by the objection, this may immediately be met by the objection that I have misdescribed the case. Well, what I say may be true for, as it were, gross appetites, namely that the striving for an object sub ratione boni is not reliably correlated with the attainment of a state in which the agent enjoys that object. This will not be true if we sum over the infinity of petite apperceptions that collectively define the conatus of a monad at a given moment. According to Leibniz, the sum of all these strivings for the good, together with the laws of appetites, must determine the monad's subsequent state. I've already offered textual evidence on that. With this general statement, I am not in disagreement. My qualification comes in how we characterize the petite apperceptions that together provide the monad's motive force. If each of these is conceived on analogy with a gross appetite, that is, as a force that operates sub ratione boni, then each is liable to miss the mark in the same way as a gross appetite can. Right? If a gross appetite can fail to be satisfied, each of these individual appetitions could be. And if each is liable to fail in this way, then there can be no coherent explanation of how the occurrence of the aggregate of those appetitive forces is deterministically correlated with the production of a certain consequent state. More obviously needs to be said about this, but time is running short. Probably I'm over time already. So let me just conclude by some bald assertions of how I think Leibniz should be understood. First, 3 points. First, Leibniz requires and has a distinction between two senses in which a monad's appetitions are directed toward the good. In an earlier essay, I characterized this as the distinction between desire teleology and natural teleology. Gross appetites or desires operate according to the law of desire teleology. They are directed tendencies toward an object or end represented as good from the perspective of an agent. They're strivings for the good represented as good. The law of desire teleology dictates that, other things being equal, an agent will tend toward the object represented as its greatest good. However, there is no certainty that it will attain it. Other causal factors may intervene. Petite apperceptions, by contrast, should be seen as directed toward the good in a different sense, I argue. They are directed toward physical microstates, representations of physical microstates, which collectively determine the next best state of the physical world in which the agent represents itself